Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. Hope you guys been enjoying the content channel as of late. Sorry if I'm kind of speeding through this. I trusted that my camera here would go for more minutes, but it wouldn't. So I'm gonna do this bite-sized once again. So we're here to do something unique because I have been tracking box office for this year so far, and I've noticed lately that I've been very specific in terms of my look at things. So I wanted to do things a little bit more thoroughly this time around and make it also in some ways specific at the same time. So we're going to be examining four films today that have had announcements made about follow-ups from this year and seeing if they make financial sense. And I'm considering all factors this time around: domestic gross, international gross, the cuts within that, and then ultimately the kind of money that the studio actually makes off that film. Sorry, there's a plane going by. And from that, based on that gross alone, does that make sense in terms of moving forward with a sequel? Now, in some cases, that made sense. In other cases, at least as far as my calculations are concerned, you'll see that it really didn't make sense for a couple of these movies. So let's get into this. So before we get into this, I want to just make it clear. This is how I measure box office. So if it's a single digit budget, I do two times. If it's a double digit, I do 2.5. And if it's a triple digit, I do three times. Uh, and I am examining based off of what I believe the higher margins are for these projects. So the two times, 2.5, and 3, those are based off of what I believe are the expectations of the studio, but not necessarily what the investments themselves have to do. I mean, just bare minimum, they have to do two times, to to uh, to make a return on investment. But in terms of higher margins, expectations for the companies, these are what I believe are what the numbers are. Now, I also am going to include any publicly known marketing expenses or anything relating to that, like reshoots or whatever. And we have to remember that this is a brand new thing that I'm bringing onto this discussion, is that studios and theater chains, when you look at the box office revenue, the worldwide gross, something like F1, for example, which was like $600 million, right? Seems great on paper, but what people don't want to tell you is that that revenue is actually split between studios and theater chains. Now, if you're into film, this is kind of self-explanatory, but the consideration of that factor doesn't really seem to be as prominent a lot of the times. So, and 50% is not usually the case in some manners, because there's some people that'll tell you, or actually a lot of people will say, like the first 2 weeks are actually heavily weighted on the studios. They'll make like 60 or 70% of that revenue, and then eventually it boils down to 50% after a couple weeks pass. So it's not always valid, but in terms of just where we end up, it usually is the case. So I also will factor that as well as what may be required from streaming, because the theatrical gross may not be enough to secure that investment. So sometimes studios will require streaming or VOD releases in order to make up the difference of that bare minimum of that investment itself. So hopefully that all makes sense. So we're going to examine four releases that came out this year and seeing if their investments make sense. So let's get started. So the first of these investments we're going to look at is Lilo&Stitch. Now, Lilo&Stitch, of course, being the highest-grossing film domestically, I believe so. I believe so, yeah. And yeah, yeah, I think that's it, because I think, yeah, there's other films that have outpaced Lilo&Stitch in the foreign market. But in Disney's case, anyway, this is their crown jewel. So we're going to look at this first because this has a sequel on the way, and we'll see where this ends up. So domestically speaking, the film made $423.78 million, and internationally, it actually did a lot better, doing $613.67 million, bringing its worldwide total to $1.037 billion. Now, as we said up top, that amount is not the amount that the studio makes. Disney does not make $1.037 billion. They make specific amounts based on whatever markets the film is hitting. So if you see when we break it down here, studio gross, if we're talking about domestic market, squarely to do with the U.S. Um, it's usually a 50 or 55% cut, as far as I've read. So 50% will go back to the studio, whereas the other 50 or 55% will go to the theater chains that are in the domestic market. So in that case, when you break down that number comes up to 211.89 million, or if it's a higher percentage cut or lower percentage cut, $233.08 million. So that's what Disney made in the U.S. when it came to Lilo and Stitch. Now abroad, usually it's from what I've read, a 40% cut. So in that case, and because of it actually performing a lot better overseas, the film reaped 245.47 million for Disney. Now China is a unique case because China actually acts as their own distributor when it comes to these imports. So it's not like the other markets where Disney comes in with them acting as the distributor. China actually takes on the film and becomes their own distributor. So through that, and probably through certain negotiations because of that, they actually reap larger profit off of that sale. So Disney and all studios who would usually come to China, as far as I read, they'll only make about 25% of that gross, whereas China makes the 75%. So in that case, Disney only made about $6.31 million when it came to the Chinese release. Um, so, so in terms of a worldwide studio gross, now again, as I'm just to clarify again, this is the amount of money that Disney themselves made on the movie. This is how much they made off this movie. So the worldwide gross overall, in terms of what Disney made off of Lilo and Stitch, in terms of a theatrical run, not not counting the streaming release, was 463.67 million, or as high as $484.86 million. So, putting that all in perspective and seeing that number, how does that factor into its investment? So, when we look at its investment was sitting at around 100 million apiece. So, for production and marketing, it was about 100 million apiece. So, investment wise, we're looking at $200 million. So, the higher margins it would need to hit, if we're timesing it by three, it would be around 600 million. So it didn't get to that point. But bare minimum, just to make a return on investment, it would need to do $400 million. So clearly, it was a success because it ended up making a return on investment. So there's no need to acknowledge streaming because, well, it made its money back off of the theatrical run alone and made profit because only 400 was needed in order to clear that investment. So anything else after that would just be profit. And because of that, the film made 63.67 million, or as high as 84.86 million dollars, and that's not including the streaming release still. So that number is likely higher. So maybe even $100 million that Lilo and Stitch made for the studio. So when you look at the timeline, it makes perfect sense why they announced a sequel before they dropped it on streaming, because it made its money back purely on the theatrical window. So that makes a whole lot of sense, and it makes total sense why they're doing a sequel. Makes absolute sense because there was no need to wait on streaming. There was no need to rely upon another source of revenue. The theatrical run alone made them money back, and made them money just purely for themselves. So this makes a total all the sense in the world when you put it through that prism. Now let's look at the other major hitter that came out this year, which was a Minecraft movie. Now this one didn't hit the highs as much as Lilo and Stitch did, but it got fairly close. Domestic gross sitting at a very similar number that Lilo and Stitch had, $423.95 million. Internationally, it didn't do as high. It did 534 million, but still, better than how it did here in the U.S. So bringing its worldwide total to $957.95 million. So now that we understand, what that total means, we can break it down and we can see what the film actually made for the studio. So studio gross, if we're looking at domestic market, and if we're looking at a 50 or 55% cut, the film potentially made for the studio here in the U.S. 211.97 million, or as high as $233.17 million. Now, if we're talking the international market, excluding China, we're looking at, after a 40% cut, $213.60 million. And if we're talking squarely on China, with that 25% cut that they get, $7.3 million. So worldwide total, as a studio made, like I said, what the studio made off the movie, they made 432.87 million, or as high as $454.07 million. So now, how does that amount of money contribute to its investment? So in this case, production was a little bit higher than Lilo and Stitch. It was about 150. Marketing expenses were never fully disclosed, but I'm pretty sure they were hefty. So I'm guessing around 100 million, because I remember they were marketing the hell out of that film. So we have an investment sitting at around $250 million. So the higher margins for on this end would be around 750, but bare minimum it would need to do at least $500 million. So on a theatrical run, it did not end up making its money back. So it had to rely upon streaming. So in this case, when you break it down, because this is the amount of money that this movie needed to do, regardless. I mean, this is what the studio would want this movie to do, but ultimately, in terms of a return on investment, this is the amount of money that it needs to do. So ultimately, with it doing these amounts right here, we have to subtract this out in order to see how much money is required still. And this amount right here, 45.93 million to 67.13 million, that's the amount of money that it would need to have done on streaming. Because, streaming also, they purely make alone. 100% that money is theirs. VOD is kind of a different scenario as well, but I do also factor in VOD when it comes to that number as well. And that's what they have to make up, So, so when you look at their timeline, when they announced their sequel, this was after VOD and streaming, and this was months after. So the movie came out in April, VOD release was in May, streaming thing was in June. So they waited throughout the summer to see how it would do, and I'm pretty sure, given how much they actually needed to do, about $40 or $60 million, I think that that's doable on streaming. We're not talking about major losses here, or major need to make money, like hundreds of millions of dollars. We're talking $40-60 million. So I think streaming was able to to collect that. So and you saw that their announcement, they made it way after. So this is a smart investment here, because they saw that they didn't make all their money back theatrically. So they decided to wait it out with streaming to see how it would do. Gave it pretty much the entire summer season. And because of what they probably ended up getting out of it and making this money back, they now can move forward with the sequel. So you can start to see how much money studios actually make off these films, and if streaming is needed or not at that point. So in this case, anyway, it was needed, but it was not that big of a necessity. It was just enough to satisfy. And when you see the timeline, it makes sense why it took a little bit of time for them to announce the sequel, because they needed to still make up some money, and they more than likely did. Now, not every investment is going to be justifiable. In the case of How to Train Your Dragon, you're going to see how certain films probably don't necessarily feel justified in getting a sequel. So, in the case of How to Train Your Dragon, we look at the domestic gross, which was $262.96 million. International gross was a little bit better, pulling in $372.92 million, bringing its total to $635.88 million. And when we break it down, domestically, if it was a 50 or 55% cut, film made about $131.48 million, or as high as $144.63 million. International, excluding China, we're looking at 149.17 million. And if we're just talking purely about China, made about $9.93 million after those cuts are taken into consideration. So worldwide gross if my numbers are correct, because I just want to preface also that these numbers could be wrong, uh, or at least just my calculations could be wrong. The overall gross for the film, we're looking at 290.58 million or $303.73 million. So roughly $300 million that was potentially made off of How to Train Your Dragon. That was purely their money, purely the money that they collected off of it. So how did this factor into its investment? So this we know for a fact actually had 100 million as a marketing. Production we know was 150. So investment overall was 250. So in terms of just bare minimum where it would need to do, we're talking at least $500 million. Where its higher margins, it was $750 million. So obviously it went below that, so it was not close to securing its investment. So they had to go to streaming. So they had to go to VOD and streaming with this amount to contend with, which was once you subtract out bare minimum what it needs to do in order to be considered a worthwhile investment, to get a return on investment. When you subtract out what it did in theaters to what it needs to do on streaming, 196.27 million or as high as $209.42 million. That's a lot of money that they need to make up. And in this case, they made the announcement before the movie came out. So this was made during, I believe it was CinemaCon, and this was also, I think, when they premiered this movie at the same time. So you could see where this is, and this is just now popping on streaming, popping on Peacock. It was on VOD for a little bit. VOD releases are typically a month after films in theaters. But yeah, so that's the amount they had to contend with potentially. So you could see where this sequel probably didn't make a whole lot of sense, because I severely doubt that streaming has the capacity to make that kind of money. Because if it does, then stream studios would be flocking to their streaming platforms all the time. Because just to note, this amount of money when they put it on their streaming platform, talking squarely streaming like Peacock, that's their money to make. That's their money to make. No one else, like VOD, they still have to probably get a little bit of a cut. They still probably have to give a little bit of a cut to that platform because ultimately they are requesting for their piece of content to be put on someone else's platform. Whereas this, when they put it on Peacock, they are making all that profit. Universal makes all that profit because they're the financiers, and it's their own streaming service. So if streaming services were making this amount of money on movies, oh, trust me, there'd be so many movies on streaming, and that's what was the whole point of doing the HBO Max strategy. And well, we saw how that turned out. So this doesn't seem like a smart investment. This doesn't seem like something that they should be doing. So yeah, it may seem like it was a success in the theatrical run, but when you break it down, probably wasn't. So. And this brings us to our last one for today, which is Superman. Now, Superman's been kind of the point of just discussion about whether or not it was a success or not. I think that most people, when they just kind of look at it at face value, will tell you it wasn't a success. And as we go through this, you will definitely see why it was not a success, at least according to my calculations. So Superman, how it did domestically, it did about 354.18 million here in the U.S. Internationally, it didn't do as big, did about 261.80 million. So it actually had stronger legs here in the U.S. than it did in its foreign markets. But it had a worldwide total of 615.98 million. So raw numbers, as we discussed, didn't surpass Man of Steel, which I said before is not a good look for what is supposed to be the starting point of a brand new universe. Man of Steel didn't have those intentions. Superman did. So, but it gets even worse when you actually break it all down. So, domestically speaking, studio, depending on the cuts that they got, based on the agreements they made with theaters, 50 to 55% cut. Film made about 177.09 million, or as high as 194.799 million. Now, on the international side of things, after a 40% cut, we're looking at 104.72 million. And if we're just talking squarely to do with China, $2.225 million. So overall, what Warner Brothers made off the movie, if we're talking just squarely on a theatrical run, 284.035 million, or as high as $301.744 million. Now, how does this number factor into its investment? Well, this is a more substantial investment. So, production wise, we're looking at $225 million, marketing expenses as high as $125 million. So, investment wise, we're sitting at $350 million. So, the higher margins this film would need to hit, aka what the company's expectations would probably were for this movie, $1.05 billion, and bare minimum just to make a return on investment, $700 million. Now, I know James Gunn has said publicly that, oh, that's not the case. Remember, a lot of the times when it comes to these investments, the studios are probably just considering production. They're not considering marketing and all the other expenses that have come along with it. So they're only considering this number here. So when you consider that number only and you do the math, it probably does check out in terms of his rationale, but it's not the full story because you have marketing to contend with and all the other factors that you have to contend with as well, like reshoots or whatever. Um, so and that's not giving the full scope of things. So really, Superman needed to do $700 million. So with it only performing to 284.035 or as high as 301.744, this is the amount that the film needed to have to do on streaming or slash VOD in order to justify its investment. And I severely doubt that it did that because, again, if streaming is pulling numbers like this, studios would be on streaming forever. They would be on there forever if that was the case. Because, again, as I illustrated, they would make all this money purely on their own. They wouldn't have to contend with any deals with theater chains or having distribution being handed off to a different country or whatever like that. They purely make that money themselves. So now, when you actually look at the timeline for this, they had a VOD release, but not a streaming release prior to their announcement of a sequel. They had a VOD release about a month later, as seems per usual now with just regular releases, and it had a sequel announcement made 2 weeks prior to its streaming release on HBO Max. So again, maybe my numbers are not completely accurate, but if that is the case, that tells you quite a bit in terms of number one, the state of this universe, which is that it's in big trouble. I've heard Peacemaker also, the second season, did not perform well either. Um, it just further illustrates just where things are and validates more of my claim that I just believe that the sequel is the result of a creative decision, not necessarily a financial one. And also probably illustrates again who is probably more in charge of that department, not the CEOs up front, but someone down here, which is not a healthy relationship if you ask me, a la Joker, Folia Dukes. So yeah, so it's hard to see why we're getting a sequel once you really put it through all that understanding. So as you can see, some of these films make sense, when it comes to doing another film, and it does make sense. In the case of Lilo and Stitch and a Minecraft movie, those investments do make sense because either they made purely profit off of their theatrical run, or they needed some assistance off of streaming, but the margins weren't the amounts weren't as high, so streaming can supply it. Whereas of other films like How to Train Your Dragon and Superman, they didn't do as well because either their investments are too heavy, or they didn't pull as heavily or as harder as they needed to, and as a result, they needed to make more money off of the streaming release, and streaming does not have that capacity. So there's a lot of lessons that can be taken here, one of which, as we've talked about many, many times, these investments are just way too heavy. Looking at Superman purely on its own, a $350 million investment is insane. That's just crazy. and other investments like How to Train Your Dragon 250, F1, which was like almost 400 million, Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning, when you consider all of its factors, potentially $500 million. It's crazy. And the more money that you put into a project, the higher margins that it needs to hit, the higher of much money it needs to make. And that's just considering bare minimum on its own. And in some cases that's validated, and in a lot of other cases it's not. And there's a lot of other movies that we can talk about that I might do a video on, because it's pretty telling when you actually consider all those numbers and you consider just the rationale behind these announcements. Just some of them just don't seem completely just. In the case of How to Train Your Dragon, they made the announcement before the movie came out, so that was, I think, just purely stupid, because they were going by blind confidence. They weren't considering how the movie might perform. They weren't just taking a step back and just letting it do what it needed to do. And in the case of Superman, that was purely to do with investment. I mean, $350 million poured into that project, and that is a lot weighted on something that is in the middle of also great fatigue in terms of a genre. No superhero film this year made money. Well, when you consider also Superman, none of the Marvel movies made a dime, and we'll talk about those probably in another video, just so we can kind of surmise just how this year's been really going, which is pretty rough. So, but that's just my viewpoint on all of this. I could be completely wrong with my numbers, but you guys let me know. Am I off base? Am I not considering a factor here, or am I on the money? Let me know. Let me know all your thoughts in the comment section below. And that's gonna be it for this video, guys. Thank you guys for tuning in. And until then, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye.